On this episode of What the Ship, we look at the top 5 stories in the maritime sector. We're going to look at ship collisions and ship fires at sea. We're going to discuss the East Coast longshoremen potentially going on strike on the eve of the presidential election. We'll talk about renewed attacks in the Red Sea and by Israel against Yemen. We'll talk about the spike in exports coming out of Ukraine. And is global shipping setting up for a spike in inflation? All of that on this week's What the Ship. I'm your host, Sal Mercogliano. I'm back. That's right. We're done with the cruise. We're done with the vacation. It's been a long vacation. There was a lot of trials and tribulations I will not bore you with, but it is good to be back home, and more importantly, good to be back here and getting you episodes of what's going on with shipping. Today, we're going to do a big story. We're going to do our 5 big stories, our What the Ship. I did a small story just coming back on the loss of a towboat in the Houston Ship Channel. If you get a chance to check that out, I posted it yesterday. Go take a look at it. But today we're going to look at 5 big stories and how they impact you, the consumer, the shipper, the carrier, you name it. What does this mean going forward? Because global shipping touches all our lives, and that's what we're going to talk about in this episode. If you're new to the channel, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come out. All right, our first story deals with a collision off the coast of Malaysia and a ship fire off the coast of India. We'll look at the collision first. This story from Reuters: Malaysian Coast Guard says tanker involved in fire has left sight. I'm going to bring up this is the track from marine traffic of the Hyphen Nile over the past 3 days. You'll see it coming through the Straits of Malacca. It will anchor off Singapore for a brief period of time and then head out into the South China Sea. The story says this from Reuters: Malaysia's Coast Guard said on Saturday that one of the 2 large oil tankers involved in a collision that led to fires on both had left the location of the accident and is believed to have turned off its tracking system. The Cerces 1, which is the tanker that's going to be hit, is from Sao Tome and Principe flagged. Quick note here: all that traffic you're seeing is the Singapore Straits. It is insane. When you look at a place like the Singapore Straits, it gives you an idea of just the madness that goes on here. I'm going to remove some ship names just to kind of clear this up a bit. All those red dots and triangles there are tankers. The green ones are cargo ships. The purple ones are private vessels. Dark blue are passenger vessels. Light blue are tugboats. And Hyphen Nile is going to sit there off Singapore for a few days. Back to the story, the Cerces 1 was involved in a collision reported early on Friday with the Singapore-flagged Hyphen Nile about 55 kilometers, 35 miles northeast of the Singaporean island of Pedra Branca, the Maritime and Port Authority of Singapore said on Friday. The 40-person crew on Cerces 1 were all accounted for, the MPA has said, adding that 14 had been evacuated by a Singapore Air Force helicopter, while 26 were conducting firefighting operations on board. The Chinese owner of the Cerces 1 could not be reached for comment for a very good reason. The Cerces 1 fled the scene afterwards and has not been located. However, Iran's oil ministry said on Saturday that neither ship had been carrying Iranian crude. The area where Cerces 1 had been anchored is known to be a so-called dark fleet ships for the transfer of Iranian oil in contravention of U.S. sanctions, according to Michelle Weiss-Bachmann, an analyst over at Lloyd's List. Now, the shadow fleet or the dark fleet, or what I like to call the parallel fleet, is a group of ships that have moved out of the normal insurance, registration, for most of the world's fleet, are now involved in this other area where they can haul Russian oil. They're not doing things illegally, because the way the sanctions work is you have to be under a certain registry and with certain insurance companies, and the way the Russians get around that is by finding these other companies or creating these. It goes on that Cerces 1 had gone dark many times, referring to turning off its AIS, its automated identification system. The 74,000 deadweight ton tanker, Panamax tanker, Hyphen Nile, was carrying about 300,000 barrels of naphtha, according to ship tracking data from Kepler. All 22 crew aboard the Hyphen Nile were evacuated and arrived in Singapore on Friday. A video taken on Saturday and posted by the Malaysian Coast Guard showed the charred Hyphen Nile afloat. Singapore's MPA did not immediately respond to a request for comment. Salvage experts boarded the Hyphen Nile and established a towing connection with one of the attending tugs. The tanker's operator, Hyphen, said in a statement on Saturday, quote, "A first assessment on board the vessel confirms that no visible flames are observed. Pollution levels around the vessel are still undetermined. Discussions are underway with Malaysian authorities to safely move the tanker." Hyphen also said it's cooperating with Singapore on the ongoing investigation into the cause. Singapore is Asia's biggest oil trading hub and the world's largest bunkering port. Its surrounding waters are amongst the busiest global sea lanes. Here is Hyphen of Nile heading out at this time. I'm going to go ahead and zoom out here a little bit. You'll see it coming out. I'm going to throw up here real quick the nautical chart for the area. You'll see it's in a vessel traffic scheme coming out of the area here, but now it's back out into the open sea. Go ahead and back to our satellite map. Here is Hyphen of Nile heading northward. It's going to turn left, heading a little bit more northward as it comes up into this area. And as you'll see here, it's going to rapidly approach the area where Circes 1 is. I'm going to go ahead and stop here for a second, recenter ourselves, slow down a bit. And you see this right here is Circes 1. Here comes Hyphen of Nile. No clear reason why Hyphen of Nile will just plow right there into Circes 1. Not sure if they never saw them, if the bridge watch was in lax. There would be no pilot on board the vessel at this time, so it would be the crew of Hyphen of Nile navigating, and pretty clear they ran smack into Circes 1 and broke the ship free from its anchor, because now it is drifting at this point. Either broke it free from its anchor or the ship was getting ready to up anchor. Both vessels now are adrift at this time. We see them kind of moving. There is Circes 1 drifting. Here comes Dolphin 1. Dolphin 1 is a small tanker, obviously coming alongside Circes to provide assistance. And you'll see both ships drifting off here. Eventually what happens is the AIS on Hyphen of Nile will be turned off. Here's marine traffic on Dolphin 1. Again, a small oil products tanker, 31 years old, just 65 meters in length. Obviously not enough to provide any major assistance, but enough to help evacuate crew members. This is Circes 1. Again, this tanker, 23 years old, out of San Tome Principe, one of these key registries that exist, being used right now by the Russians to get around. Almost a 300,000 ton tanker, so a big tanker, 329 meters. And here's Hyphen of Nile, 74,000 tons, 228 meters, Singapore flagged vessel that was involved in the collision. These images come from the Republic of Singapore Navy, giving you some of that, showing the Hyphen of Nile and some of the crew being evacuated at this time. Again, great response by local Navy and Coast Guards to incidents at sea. For Malaysia and Singapore, this is a big problem. These illegal ship-to-ship transfers take place off the island, and there's a big fear for environmental issues. Circes 1 is one of the ships involved in the Dark Fleet, and I had a discussion on Twitter X about this, and somebody said it's really not relevant that it's a Dark Fleet vessel. I think it is, because these ships are operating outside the normal bounds of inspections, and that means that they're not being regulated as other vessels, and that means accidents are more likely to happen. Let's go over to our ship fire that took place off the west coast of India. This is the motor vessel Maersk Frankfurt, a fairly newer vessel in the Maersk fleet, but a bit on the smaller side. The vessel was sailing from Mundra in India down to Colombo in Sri Lanka when the fire took place in the forward stacks. You'll see a large plume here forward. Now, we're not sure what the cause is. Usually what happens on container ships, it's some sort of hazardous material that has shifted inside the containers. This could be corrosive material, it could be batteries, it could be almost anything. We have no idea what this could be, but it is enough to ignite a fire. And the problem on board a container ship is once the fire starts in the container, it's really hard to access the containers. And more importantly, as the containers ignite, they spread from container to container. It becomes almost a domino effect. Here's the scene from the bridge looking forward. That is not a great scene from your bridge window, especially because you know that fire is going to start lapping back towards you. You'll see the ship's crew coming into action, getting some hoses on the fire. It is impossible to get into the interior of these containers that are stacked up high. So your best bet is to try to get some large water, 2.5-inch hoses, onto the fire, start cooling it down, while at the same time cooling down the other stacks to prevent them from catching on fire. But in truth, a ship's crew is very limited in their ability to fight this type of fire. They need some sort of external help. And the group that came to their assistance was the Indian Coast Guard. And here we see the arrival of several Indian Coast Guard vessels. We know of 3 that arrived on scene: the Sachet, the Sujit, and the Samarat. I apologize if I got those wrong. I did the best I could, along with Indian Coast Guard seaplanes. And you'll notice here the fire is still ongoing at this time. While you don't see flame, there's still fire on board. You'll notice here the 4th rack of containers here, or 4th cell of containers here, has collapsed along with containers in the 5th cell. They have collapsed. That means that the integrity of the containers had heated up so much they have basically collapsed onto themselves. However, they do have what seems to be the fire partially contained to the forward part of the ship. The Indian Coast Guard on their Twitter page have put out a batch of videos. Here you see the arrival of one of those Indian Coast Guard cutters coming in and using their high volume, high velocity water right there to get onto the fire. That's what you need. You need a lot of water. They could actually vent through there because of the heat. And as you'll see later on, we do see that that probably did happen in that stack. Some more video here during the day where the fire has been pretty much extinguished. But again, you're seeing those Coast Guard cutters coming alongside, trying to get water. A very tough thing. You can see the ship's rolling at this time. Hard to get that water on. That's some of their Dornier seaplanes of the Indian Coast Guard coming in. It's just a lot of effort to try to get water onto those stacks because of the rolling nature of the ship, but they're doing a good job in trying to cool the neighboring stacks and preventing them from catching fire. Here we get a helicopter view of the ship, a really good one. You get a little better view there of that collapsed stack in the center. You'll see the Indian Coast Guard vessel off the starboard side, providing some extinguishing agent onto the ship. Again, what they will do now is divert this vessel to port to try to extinguish this fire and make sure that they do not have a restart of the fire. So this is a really interesting video they put out. Here comes an Indian helicopter over an area. You can still see some fire on board the vessel here, kind of hard to distinguish, but this helicopter is coming overhead. So here's the view from the helicopter, and what's really interesting here is the method they're using to fight fire. You'll see that they're going to start dropping big plastic bags into the fire. Now, I've been a volunteer firefighter for 25 years now, and one of the fires that we deal with are chimney fires, and chimney fires are very common. People don't clean their chimneys, and one of the ways we put out a chimney fire is you don't want to use water because it heats up the brick and cracks the mortar. We drop bags of dry chemical down the chimney, or blow it up the chimney, sometimes with a fan. That seems to be what they're doing here. They're dropping bags of dry chemical into the fire. Those bags are going to go down, they'll melt in the heat, the bags, and then the powder will spray out, and that will break up the chain reaction. It's an interesting method. I'm not sure how effective it's going to be. It's probably more effective than just dumping water on it. Again, a novel method being used here by the Indian Coast Guard. I have not seen this in operation before on a shipboard fire. Now, the danger here is that they get the fire, they think extinguished, but then it rekindles back up. We had a instance of this back in May of 2021. This is the Express Pearl. This was a container ship that was sailing out of the Persian Gulf. It was off the coast of India. It got down to Sri Lanka, and it had a fire on board, hazardous material. They thought they had the fire out. It rekindled, and the ship sank off the port of Colombo, created a huge environmental problem. This is what they want to prevent happening on board the Maersk Frankfurt. A statement out from Maersk is saying this: we can confirm that the fire was reported on board one of our time-chartered vessels, the Maersk Frankfurt, around 14:30 IST, while the ship was sailing from Mundra to Colombo. Firefighting is underway with support from the Indian Coast Guard. The vessel is in stable condition. At the moment, we were unable to confirm the extent of the fire's impact on the chartered vessel, Maersk Frankfurt. They really want you to know this is a chartered vessel and not one they own. It almost is like a lawyer has helped write this statement. We are in constant touch with the vessel owner and ship managers. Notice, not us. It's not us. It's the vessel owner and ship management. The safety of the crew remains a top priority at this moment, the statement ends. And then we're seeing updates being provided by the Indian Coast Guard on Twitter. A really interesting event. I got to say, the Indians are doing top-notch job in fire prevention and firefighting, both from attacks on ships by the Houthi and now, in this case, off the coast. They did get a little bit of flack back when Express Pearl burned, that they didn't provide enough assistance to it. It looks like the Indian Navy and Coast Guard are on the game right now. All right, let's go ahead and jump over to our next story. Story number 2 deals with labor negotiations on the East Coast of the United States. Now, you may remember on this channel, we follow the trials and tribulations of the West Coast labor negotiation between the ILW, the International Longshore and Warehouse Union, and the PMA, the Pacific Maritime Association. That was quite a ongoing battle all the time. But eventually we got to the point where the West Coast dock workers approved a new 6-year labor contract. And there was mass hysteria and cheering throughout the world. The white smoke came out of the negotiations in San Francisco. It was great. It had been a long battle. It cost the West Coast a lot, I think. They don't want to admit it, but I think it did. We saw that movement of cargo from the West Coast over to the East Coast. Now, ports like Long Beach have records setting years right now. They're doing fantastic right now, but it definitely was an impact. Well, now we're looking at a similar situation on the East Coast between the two entities there. In this case, it is the United States Maritime Alliance Limited. They represent the shippers, the container companies, the shipping companies, the terminals, the ports. Now, not all. They are not as extensive as we saw the ILW and the PMA were on the West Coast. They controlled almost everything. It's not quite the same on the East and Gulf Coast. But USMX, which I don't understand that acronym at all. I don't understand why it's not USMA, but it's USMX, is the negotiating partner with this. And then the other one is the ILA, the International Longshoremen's Association. They're representing the longshoremen on the East and Gulf Coast. Again, not every port is unionized, but they represent them. Their contract is set to expire just prior to the presidential election. So, no problem there. I mean, I can't see that having a problem. Both sides are refusing the assistance of the Biden administration. They don't want them in it. And this has the potential to blow up on October 1st, just a month before the election of the 2 youngest men ever to run for president of the United States. I'm kidding. They're really, really old. Both of them, very, very old. And they're about to run. I myself do not affiliate myself with a party. I'm a member of the Whig Party. The Whig Party in the United States is claim to fame is two presidents, William Henry Harrison and Zachary Taylor, and both of them died in office. William Henry Harrison was the oldest president at the time at 68. 68, a young buck among current presidential nominees. Anyway, back to the story. The ILA and the U.S. Maritime Association are in this negotiation. Now, both of them had walked away from the table here, but now the word is that they're about ready to come back. This is the statement from the USMA. Their statement, as we have done in the past and in respects to the process, USMX, again, it makes no sense, this acronym, remains steadfast in our commitment to keep ongoing negotiations out of the press until bargaining is complete. We would like to reassure our customers and the public that there is forward movement toward resolution of the local issues that are currently being reported through the media. To avoid any further disruption to the cargo flow and or damage to the nation's economy, USMX remains ready, willing, and able to return to the bargaining table with the ILA to resume master contract negotiations and to reach a new master contract agreement. I find it very interesting they say that, because I'm hearing a lot about this contract and the negotiations. So while they want to keep it out of the press, it doesn't quite keep out of the press, although I'm not really the press, but they do like to talk. This is the statement a few days previously from Harold Daggett, the president of the ILA. He says, the leader of the International Longshore Association says the threat of a strike at all Atlantic and East Coast ports is becoming more likely as time is growing short before the current contract expires in 80 days on September 30th. Harold Daggett, ILA president, who you cannot help but see in every image from the ILA, and the union's chief negotiator said the employers represented by the U.S. Maritime Alliance are running out of time to negotiate a new master contract. It goes on here and talks about why there was a breakdown. The ILA canceled master contract talks with USMX after discovering that the APM, that's the AP Moller, that's the Maersk terminals, and Maersk Line were utilizing an auto gate system which autonomously processes trucks without ILA labor. This system, initially identified at the port of Mobile, Alabama, is reportedly being used in other ports as well. The ILA said on June 10th that it would not meet with USMX until the AutoGate issue is resolved. Additionally, the union is still waiting on results from an audit for jobs created out of new technology, a report they've been anticipating for almost 2 contract periods. The ILA has observed an increasing number of IT personnel on marine terminals with concerns that APM and Maersk IT departments in Charlotte, North Carolina are encroaching on this jurisdiction. The issue in labor negotiations in shipping is automation. It is all automation. It is the thing that is the big concern. The unions are worried that they're going to be automated out of a job. Shippers want to make things move more efficiently, and that requires automation, and that's where the loggerhead is. They got to come to a resolution about this. Now, you can phase in automation as members of the ILA retire. That's what needs to be done. We need more automation. We need to make it more efficient. Understand, the issue that's dogging them right now is that U.S. ports are the slowest. If you look at every rating of the U.S. port, there's the big one that comes out from the World Bank that says that U.S. ports are at the bottom. But the reason U.S. ports are at the bottom isn't because it takes long to move a container on and off a ship. It doesn't. Cranes, humans in cranes can move containers as fast as machines can anywhere in the world, and our container operators can move them. The problem is processing the containers in the terminals. If you look at terminals out on the West Coast, if you look at LBCT, the Long Beach Container Terminal, or TrayPac over in Los Angeles, they move very efficiently. They have been able to incorporate not just automation, but also technology so that you can move faster. I mean, it's very funny. We just had cyber issue that grounded airlines, and the one airline that didn't get grounded was Southwest because their system was so old that it just kept going. And I actually posted something the other day where I was sitting in the airport and I was looking at the gate terminals where they're using dot matrix printers and what I consider to be a derivation of Oregon Trail for how they board people on the ship, on the plane. And one of the things that kept coming back was, listen, that system is like foolproof. No one can hack it. And more importantly, you don't have to worry about updates for it. It works. It's a system that works. Why change it? You would just have to get into a new system and require continual updates to it. Plus, it'll be susceptible to damage. That's the problem we have in freight right now, especially in ocean freight, where they're using systems that are really old, archaic, is very hard to automate. And to get people to automate requires going to the next step, but it exposes them to danger. It exposes them to cyber attacks. What happened with Maersk with the NotPetya virus. All of that is in the back of everyone's minds. And so while the operators and terminal operators want to automate, the unions are fighting this. And, people want to argue unions this, unions that, and everything. Unions provide protection for workers. I am not a strong union person by any means. However, when you're sitting there at home on Labor Day, understand it was unions that got you that. When you're working your 8-hour day, 5 days a week, unions got you there. I'm not a biggest fan of unions all the time, especially the amount of money that the administrators get and the top heaviness and the dues that the lower ones have to pay. I'm not crazy about it. But in the shipping industry, unions are as old as shipping is. It's one of the reasons why shipping is where it is today in some ways, good or bad. And what the ILA and the USMX, USMA, are negotiating is really key. If they go on strike on October 1st, 5 weeks before the presidential election, this could cause havoc. And they probably have not been in a stronger position to negotiate than ever before. And I am not going to be surprised if this goes down to the wire, if not past it. All right, let's go ahead and head over to our next story. So our next story takes us to the Red Sea and that ragtag group of little tiny freedom fighters known as the Houthi and their attack against defenseless commercial vessels on the high sea. Yes, I do have a problem with the Houthis attacking commercial vessels on the high sea. And the Houthi have upped their attacks. However, I want to put this into context because we just witnessed a strike by the Israelis against Western Yemen. They attacked military targets, including fuel storage facilities. I would show them to you, but for some reason, every time I show a video in an educational and informational way, YouTube decides to demonetize my videos. And I don't understand. I've argued this with them before. I'm not showing blood. I'm not showing gore. I'm not showing violence just to show violence. I'm doing it in an information way, but that doesn't seem to get through to them. But the attacks have been increasing. We just saw a new range of attacks. This story out in G-Captain, 2 attacks northwest of Yemen's Mocha reported. These are the latest attacks that we've seen on vessels. We've also, if you look at the Washington Institute site, I've got a great interview coming up here shortly with one of the designers of this site talking about this. We saw the attack on the Chios Lion, a very dramatic attack with an uncrewed surface vessel. Attacks against Bentley 1, other attacks against merchant vessels, attack against Maersk Sentosa, just a uptick in the number of attacks that are taking place. And does this represent a uptick in the number of Houthi attacks? In other words, are the Houthi are just increasing their level of attacks? I actually think it's not that. I think it's because the U.S. military, along with the United Kingdom and even the European Union and other navies, are pulling back and changing their method of their defense. I posted this over on Twitter, and I'll have a link to this, which is an unroll of that thread so that you can take a look at it. It's my discussion, what I call a tale of 2 carriers. And what's happening right now is the USS Eisenhower battle group has just returned home to great fanfare. The USS Teddy Roosevelt has arrived in the theater, and there's supposed to be a swap out between the two. Now, the Eisenhower group has gotten a lot of accolades. The ships, the crews, the Secretary of the Navy went on board, many of the naval vessels, but behind the scenes, a USNS, U.S. naval ship with civilian crew on board, the Patuxent, arrived at home with very little fanfare. The crews on the U.S. Navy ships were awarded combat action ribbons. The civilian crews got nothing. And let me be clear, I know that combat action ribbons only go to those in the military. However, if the Navy wants to keep playing like crews on military Sea Lift Command vessels are not in the Navy, then you are not kidding anybody. 1 out of 5 vessels in the U.S. Navy have civilian crews on board. You are treating them as second-class citizens. When you give combat action ribbons and awards to military personnel for doing the same exact thing as the civilian crews do, you're treating them like crap. You are. And if you don't give them a combat action ribbon, you should at least have the maritime administrator down there to give them Merchant Marine Expeditionary medals. So we know of this going on, but one of the things that we talk about here is that with the Houthi seizure of vessels, starting with Galaxy Leader, which they're still holding, we saw the initiation of Operation Prosperity Guardian, the plus-up of CTF 153, and the decision to kind of begin this operation. Now, this was a big change in pace because it represented a change by the President and the Department of Defense to defend not just U.S. flag vessels, but all vessels. This is a marked difference than what had happened during the Iran-Iraq War and the Tanker War and Somali piracy. And if you've never seen the episode of South Park of Somali piracy, you really must. It is a classic. Operation take place, Prosperity Guardian, the shooting down of missiles. The Eisenhower battle group shifted from the Persian Gulf over to the Arabian Sea and then down into the Gulf of Aden and eventually into the Red Sea. U.S. Aegis-class destroyers, along with Royal Navy destroyers, took up guard positions between the main shipping channels in Yemen and started to shoot down drones, missiles, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, unmanned surface craft, you name it. They just went to town. But the problem was that there seemed to be no comprehension that was driving the commercial ships away wasn't just the Houthi attacks, but it was the rise in war risk insurance. When war risk insurance went from 0.02% up to 0.75 to 1%, that meant all ships under $100 million in value, that is ship and cargo, were going to divert around Africa because it is just economical to do that. And when Maersk and Hapag decided to do that on December 15th, they were on the precipice of forming a new alliance, the Gemini Alliance. They did so without really coordinating it. And what we saw was this mass wave. These images come from the IMF Port Watch, and you can see how the Suez Canal transits just dropped, Bab el-Mandeb transits dropped, and Cape of Good Hope transits just kind of peaked up. But what was even more concerning is that while the U.S. Navy went to town shooting down drones and missiles and guarding vessels, they didn't seem to be doing it for U.S. flag vessels. There were attacks against U.S. flag vessels that went very badly. On the evening of January 9th, there was a big attack on 4 U.S. flag vessels. There were problems in communications, although no U.S. vessels were hit. It was a bit of a cluster. And then on January 24th, you had 2 U.S. flag vessels, the Maersk Detroit, Maersk Chesapeake, try to run through the area, and they were turned around. For the first time, U.S. vessels were turned around. In other words, U.S. vessels can't sail where they want to go. And this is a key element. Freedom of the seas is a key thing. We went to war over this multiple times. World War I, the reason we go into World War I, read Wilson's speech in April of 1917. It is freedom of the seas. It's friggin' point number 1 of the 14 points he makes. Not a big fan of Wilson all the time for what he does, but that was one of the key things that we did. We defended shipping before our arrival into World War II. We were convoying ships across. There's the loss of Reuben James on Halloween of 1941. Robin Moore, a U.S. freighter heading up to Africa with cargo. This is key. We do this all the time, yet for some reason we decided not to do it. And instead what we see is operations like the European Union's Operation Aspides, which is using their ships, the ships of the Marine Nationale and the Italian Navy, to guard their own vessels. They're providing close-in escort so that lines like Grimaldi and CMA CGM can still run vessels through the area, whereas the U.S. is not doing that. And this goes back to this larger issue then. What is going on with the arrival of the Teddy Roosevelt? The Eisenhower group left, but it doesn't appear that it has been replaced. We got word that the Teddy Roosevelt arrived in the AOR. Konstantin Toropin over at military.com did me a great favor. He asked a Navy official about it, and he said that the TR and its 4 escorting destroyers, there's no cruiser with it, which is kind of strange, arrived in the Arabian Sea, but we don't know that the Cole, the Russell, the McCain, or the Inouye are anywhere near the coast of Yemen right now, which indicates to me that the U.S. Navy is backing off Operation Prosperity Guardian. And if they are backing off Operation Prosperity Guardian, leaving it to the European Union, who has come out, by the way, and said they don't have enough assets to do this, then that means ships are more exposed to attack. But the question is, okay, who's sending their vessels in? This great tweet over by Ed Finley over on Twitter was kind of chastising Harry Vassis, Greek ship owner, for sending in his vessels into the area. He had sent in Transworld Navigator, which was hit. He sent in Chios Lion. And again, the question is, Greek ship owners, or any ship owner, is going to send their ships into the area if it's economical, if it's cheaper. I know that ship owners will sit there and say, oh, you know, we're out here for the safety of the cruise. Okay, it's good. I'm glad you're saying that. But your overriding issue is money. Let's be clear about that. It is money. If it is cheaper to go through the Red Sea, you will go through the Red Sea. Guaranteed. You will do it in a second. Guaranteed. They diverted because of the money issue, and that was the big concern that happened. Now, this has exposed shipping for more attacks, and the Houthi have launched their attacks. Now, the Houthi will attack, I think, any ship. They use their 4 degrees of separation to Kevin Bacon to do it. I keep getting told we're in the 4th level of Houthi operations, meaning that any company that has a ship that touches Israel or connected to the US or UK is fair game. Okay, I mean, that again, it's the 4 degrees of separation of Kevin Bacon. That's what you're doing now. You're just trying to connect the dots. And what is actually happening is you're causing more of an ecological, environmental damage to the region than what you're inflicting on the world. The hit on the Chios Lion, which was a tanker, which again, I'd be happy to show you the video, but YouTube would demonetize me, is leaving a massive oil slick off the region. This is also after the United Nations, the United States, and a whole batch of nations pooled resources together to drain the FSO Safer, a vessel that was decaying off the coast of Yemen, loaded with over 1 million barrels of fuel to prevent an environmental damage just prior to this. So the world came to the aid of Yemen, and now Yemen is attacking commercial shipping off its coast. And this oil slick is going to be a big problem. But it does appear that the Department of Defense, the Navy, the Fifth Fleet, the combined maritime forces have altered their tactics. They are no longer providing that blanket protection for all ships in the area, which raises the question then, what is the Teddy Roosevelt group going to do? Are they participating in strikes? We know Israel just struck Yemen. Maybe they're keeping their distance because that's happening. But we're not seeing the movement of the destroyers into the region. And matter of fact, if you look at U.S. shipping, it is intentionally avoiding the area. We are sending our ships all the way around Africa. U.S. flag ships are avoiding this. And to me, that sends a terrible message to not just the Houthis, but to anyone that will pull back. Remember, the people who are backing the Houthis is Iran. And now Iran finds it in control of two maritime choke points, Straits of Hormuz and the Bab el-Mandeb. Cheers. I don't have anything to drink. I didn't bring a drink with me today. So they're controlling two of the key maritime choke points. Who does that raise concern with? Well, the world for shipping, but more importantly, Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia's got to be worried about this because they're bottlenecked on two ends. Egypt is losing massive amounts of money. Just a report came out that Egypt has lost $2 billion in tolls. Here's a story over in Maritime Executive about that loss. In FY 23-24, the Suez Canal Authority revenue fell to $7.2 billion from $9.4 billion the prior year, a drop of about 23%. The total tonnage passing through the canal fell by a third, and the number of transits declined by about 22% year over year, as the Houthi attacks only began in earnest in November of 2023 after half of the fiscal year had passed. The numbers partially reflect business as usual performance last summer and fall. It's going to have a much larger impact here in the next upcoming fiscal year. So with Egypt having a major hand here now, with Iran having a major hand here in the Straits of Hormuz, Bab el-Mandeb, and even over in the Suez Canal region, Egypt finds itself in a very difficult position. It can't really go and smack the Houthis. It's one of the few countries that recognize the Houthis. Plus, it's got Gaza and Hamas on its border, so it really can't go in, which then makes the issue about whether or not the U.S. government understands how this confrontation is going. What is needed is not just a military approach, but a political and economic approach. I've been just reading Nick Lambert's newest book, The Neptune Factor, Alfred Mahan, and the Concept of Sea Power. And he makes the point that the military misunderstand Mahan. Mahan has always been viewed as decisive battle. We're going to use military might to effect change. Go in for the decisive battle and you win. What they fail to realize is that the key issue here is economics. And when you go down and you kind of peel it off, you start understanding that. So what's going to bring shipping back to the region is not a defeat of the Houthis, but a reduction in the war risk insurance. And so while we're winning the tactical level here, shooting down a ton of missiles and drones, we're losing the operational and the strategic level. And to me, that is the big concern. And when you look at what's happening with shipping, and these graphs from Alpha Line kind of indicate that we're seeing container ships, for example, not being demolished. So we're seeing a reduction in the number of container ships going off because you need them for those longer hauls around Africa. Ton miles, you can see that almost all the ultra large container vessels are going around Africa, not through the Suez Canal. That's what that blue indicates. We're seeing that companies are buying more container ships so that they can have additional container ships. And if you look at where they're being deployed, the vast majority of container ships are on that Asia to Europe run. And again, that's consuming a lot of tonnage at this time. And so while it's a tale of two carriers, it's a tale of two container ships too. The container ships are saying, oh, woe is me, we can't go through the Red Sea, the Bab el-Mandeb drink, and the Gulf of Aden. At the same time, they're making record profits. And to them, that's really the most important thing. And so it comes back to this issue then. You need the following to done. You need efforts to de-escalate the conflict in Gaza and undercut the Houthi narrative. There just needs to be that perception that the world is doing everything it can to undercut the Houthis. Now, let me be clear. I don't think even if the situation in Gaza ends tomorrow, the Houthis stop. They have a new feeling of power among the world. I don't think they just kind of back down. We need a new naval strategy beyond whack-a-drone, missile, and USV. We need to cut supplies heading to Yemen from Iran. There was just a latest report in, I think it was Financial Times, talking about Russia may be starting to supply arms to the Houthi. That has to be curtailed. And more importantly, we have to coordinate with shipping firms and insurance clubs. What can we do to resume voyages? The way we financed war risk in the world wars should be looked at. We provided part of the war risk. Now, we're not going to provide funding for ships registered in Liberia, the Marshall Islands, Panama, Isle of Man, Cyprus, Malta. But if you want to come over to the U.S. registry, we will help undercut your war risk. The U.S. government should help underwrite part of that. Not, pay for it, but underwrite it. Pay part of that payment or give tax incentives to help defer those costs. That will get U.S. vessels going through. If you eliminate the additional costs, the ships will go through. If you build it, they will come. I guarantee you that. And that's one of the things that we're missing. And then finally, the deployment of the TR may be a repeat of the Eisenhower, or it could be a watered down version and therefore expose more shipping to Houthi attacks, which helped their propaganda campaign. Either way, world trade needs some intervention or this will become the norm. And to me, there's no better norm than Norm from Cheers. That is my take on what's happening in the Red Sea. Now, this situation is developing. The Israeli attacks on Yemen, on the Houthi right now, have the potential to boil up. No telling how the Houthi take that. They are shocked, I tell you, that the Israelis would attack civilian targets. I mean, obviously, the Houthi have no problem attacking civilian targets because they've killed 4 merchant mariners on ships, even though I'm told it was an accident. Shooting missiles and unmanned surface vessels at vessels obviously will accidentally kill people. No, it intentionally kills people. When you send explosives heading towards ships, you're going to kill someone, and they have. So the situation in the Red Sea is definitely a new one and transpiring, and we're going to keep watching it. All right, let's go ahead and jump over to our next story. Story number 4 takes us over to the Black Sea, Ukraine, and Russia. One from Sam Chambers over at Splash 24/7. We're looking at Ukraine grain exports leap in the air since shipping deal with Russia expired. Now, we've been following the Black Sea as much as we've been following the Red Sea. And this has been since the Black Sea Grain Initiative fell apart. Remember, we went through several phases. I did a talk up at the Kiel International Sea Power Symposium, and I'll have the link to it above, where I kind of talked about this with the Black Sea. But you had about 3 phases in the Black Sea operation that underwent. The first phase was Russia trying to cut Ukraine off from the outside. This is them moving their forces in, Ukraine mining their harbors, and basically nothing was moving out of the Gulf of Odessa. Phase 2 was the Ukrainian offensive. You sink the Moskva, you take back Snake Island, you push the Russian Black Sea fleet back to Sevastopol, and then Turkey and the UN broker the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which gets some grain moving in the area. And what we see here is that little beginning of surge of grain coming through. So when you see January 23 up until about July, August 23, that's that surge you see coming through there. And then we get into the final phase where the Black Sea Grain Initiative falls apart. The Ukraine starts targeting Russian military vessels, naval vessels. They force them to evacuate Sevastopol. They hit the Kerch Bridge, but not the main section, the section over the channel. They hit the support sections. They target some commercial vessels, but these are vessels that are supporting their military. And what you basically get is a de facto status quo with the western part of the Black Sea under Ukraine control and the central and eastern part under Russian control. And since basically October of 23, we've seen an increase in the amount of shipping and grain coming through the area. Now, it's easy to look at the Black Sea and say, okay, that's the main issues. It's the export of grain out of Ukraine. It's the export of food, fuel, and fertilizer out of Russia. But what we're seeing coming out of the Black Sea is a lot more that has a lot to do with what's going on with ocean shipping. So, for example, this story from May, Mike Scholler, war risk insurance challenges in the wake of Russia-Ukraine war. We're seeing new elements about war risk insurance. The Ukrainians are helping underwrite war risk insurance for vessels coming to their port. As I talked about in the Red Sea story, one of the key things is trying to lower the war risk sailing through that region. And Russia-Ukraine should be giving us our first indication about what countries can do to minimize that impact so that they can get commercial shipping going through areas or to their ports. In the past, this was done on a national level, but now with the change in global shipping, with open registries, flags of conveniences, things are much different. Second, Black Sea Mine Removal Initiative aims to secure Ukrainian export paths. The three NATO nations in the area, Bulgaria, Romania, and Turkey, have put together a task force to go after mines that are in the area. Understand, mines are the big game changer. Even in the Red Sea, one of the things we have not seen the Houthi do, and this is the weapon that everybody fears, is mines, because mines don't tell any difference. They will hit any ship that comes through. Once you start dropping mines, or even the threat of dropping, you don't have to drop one mine, you just have the threat of it, that shuts down shipping. And what we're seeing in the Black Sea is very much that same thing. The threat of mines, both laid by the Russians and Ukrainians, have that potential. We're also seeing the use of seized cargo. Ukraine seized a cargo ship, detained the captain for exporting looted grain. Ukraine views the grain in the territory occupied by Russia as Ukrainian grain. And if this amplifies, if we start seeing the Ukrainians seizing ships carrying Ukrainian grain out of Russian ports, this has the potential to escalate the conflict in the Black Sea. In this case, it was a small Cameroon-flagged bulker coming out of the area. But if we start seeing the larger vessels coming out, and this starts hurting Russia economically, then that could be a problem. And then Ukraine is warning about ships, warning ships of scrambled GPS navigation. This is not unusual in the Black Sea. We've seen this repeatedly of GPS scrambling. But when you start playing with navigation systems, a lot of ships have transferred over away from paper charts to pure electronic charts. GPS is an important element of this. If you start spoofing, creating problems, you can start seeing accidents, collisions, potentially groundings. This can take place not just in the Black Sea, but on a global scale. And then, of course, the big thing is the Ukrainian war is entering a new phase with oil in the crosshairs. As we were talking about before, the issue of the dark fleet, the shadow fleet, we're seeing this really ramp up. The Ukrainians and Russians are targeting infrastructure. The Russians are targeting Ukrainian grain silos in the major ports. They don't want to hit the ships. The Ukrainians are hitting Russian oil refineries. But if this escalates to start hitting ships, it's something I've warned about from the very beginning, that we could see a resumption of what we saw with the tanker war in the Persian Gulf between Iran and Iraq in the 1980s. The Russians are establishing this shadow parallel fleet, and it's growing in size. We're seeing many more vessels in this. These are ships that are being registered in countries off the beaten path: Nevis, St. Kitts, Cameroon. We saw that with the vessel, the Circes, that was in the collision. They're getting new P&I insurance clubs, not the 12 big ones in the International P&I Club, but these are kind of cheap insurance companies that the insurance probably is not going to be there if you need it, meaning that if there's an accident, there's no money at the end of it. This is a really dangerous undertaking, and the Russian-Ukrainian war is fueling this going forward. The ships that are going through the Red Sea right now, a lot of them fall into this category. Understand, China has pulled half its fleet out of the Red Sea. They're not going through. The big Costco ships don't go through there. The Chinese still view that area as a potential danger. The Russians don't. And more importantly, the Greek ship owners don't. And they're the ones who are really making a lot of money about this. And what's happening in the Black Sea is impacting the Blue Sea. And the Red and Black Sea together is the heart of the video, or the talk I gave up in Kiel, is that this can have an impact on the global shipping story. All right, let's go to our last story. Our last story is one that I'm having a hard time categorizing it, because it's catching a batch of stories across the global spectrum and putting it into context for you. So these are 3 stories. Each of them could be a story onto its own, but I really wanted to cover them here in kind of my catch-all here at the end. So this story from Bloomberg: global shipping strains spark fears of an inflation comeback. To me, this is a really interesting story because myself, John Conrad, and a few others have been talking about this for a long time. That one of the things that fueled the inflation spike we saw was those surge in shipping rates. and it had a kind of domino effect down the entire global supply chain, and the band-aid that was holding in place snapped, and you had inflation. And what you're seeing right now is kind of the same thing is happening. This story goes on to say, merchandise trade is withstanding its first post-pandemic shock with no noticeable flare-up of global consumer prices, but that's not guaranteed to last if snarls provide long-lasting or begin to bog down land-based logistics. For central banks around the world, they have begun or are preparing reductions to interest rates. Any resurgence of consumer price inflation would pose a major challenge. What could help policymakers is the maritime industry stepped up efforts to address imbalances. The fragility of global trade has been highlighted by 6 months of attacks in the Red Sea that few experts predicted would last so long. No. Once the Houthis started that attack, there was no reason for them to stop until everything stopped in Gaza, and everybody knew what was going on with Gaza was not going to stop soon. So we've heard a lot about reshoring plans. One of the statistics I've heard recently is that basically what we've gotten out of China is the extent that's going to reshore it, either moved over to Vietnam or over to Mexico. Not exactly clear we're going to see a lot more reshoring going on. This section on pass-through, Greg Davidson, co-founder and CEO of New York-based Lalo, a baby product, said that at the height of the crisis, he was paying $21,000 for a container in 2022. Now, industry speculation is that rates are headed back to $20,000, he said. That would be a markup from the $9,000 he recently paid. I've been in contact with shippers. One of them just let me know that he's shipping material from India into Chicago, and not only has that been delayed from a 60-day voyage to 90 days, but the cost is escalating exponentially at this point. And all of this is coming in at a big problem. We're seeing challenges in Europe. They're feeling this. Furniture retailers are feeling it. Life science companies, they're all seeing the beginning of this. The port congestion is beginning to hit. We see it in Singapore, Kaohsiung, over in Taiwan. Malaysia is reporting it. All this data coming out is showing this. Emily Stossel, a senior analyst at Zentia, said shippers can once again start to play carrier off each other. As the balance of negotiating power starts to swing back toward shippers, we should see spot rates start to come down again. Again, that is if we clear those major transshipment hubs. Singapore, at last report, had 2 million containers waiting to get out. It's spreading over to terminals over at Algeciras and at Tangier, the mouth of the Mediterranean Sea. But if we can get those clearances going, things look better. It goes here at the end, at Global Electric, which ships as many as 2,000 containers a year for customers across North America. Star sounded cautiously optimistic about the short-term outlook. Freight rates should start to stabilize and possibly come down in September, October. But if this continues for another 6 to 12 months, then more conversations are going to be had. Understand that all depends on a presidential election in the U.S., where President Trump is talking about the idea that tariffs may resume. There was a great piece by Greg Miller over in Lloyd's List that talks about what Trump 2.0 would look like. I'm going to do a video separate on that, along with the Heritage Report 2025 that looks at a maritime policy that I kind of disagree with. There's a shock. The other story was the recent outage by Microsoft. Shipping companies impacted around the world by Microsoft outage. This is Sam Chambers talking about it. A very brief story by Sam. Many shipping companies have been hit by today's outage. Multiple global businesses have been reported failures of Windows PC. The impact hasn't really been in shipping companies as much, but more in ancillary elements, in the ports, in the terminals, crewing, moving crew changes around. It really didn't shut down the system of the ships too much. It had more of an impact on aviation on air because of the data and the velocity that aviation moves. Ships move a bit slower. So it really didn't have as big an impact. It's one of the things about having older systems too. They are less dependent on some technology and infrastructure. So they were able to operate. But again, the fear here is that in 2017, Maersk got hit by the NotPetya virus. That took Maersk out for a week. nearly fried their entire system except for one computer in Lagos, Nigeria, that was in the middle of a blackout. It didn't get infected. And then the last story was an interesting one, is that China and Russia are forming an Arctic Express route. We've been seeing the beginning of this with ships like New Polar Bear going in, but they've launched Arctic Express #1 rail sea cargo service starting. It's a 13,000 kilometer journey. It takes 20 to 25 days, roughly 1 week faster than the Northern Sea route. New Shipping and Rostom are running the service, moving cargo by rail from Moscow to the Russian port of Archangel, from where it is shipped across the Arctic and North Pacific Oceans to ports in China. Rostom, which oversees the Northern Sea route, and New Shipping have formed this joint venture with a fleet of 5 ice-class box ships, which work all year. You just can't put any container ship on this route. You have to have an ice-strengthened ship to do it, because even though you have icebreakers and you're clearing channels, there is still pack ice in the area. Most of the large container companies and shipping companies are staying away from this because of the IMO restrictions on emissions in the Arctic. They really want to stay away from it. But as fuel changes and emissions change, and more importantly, as routes change, if the the Red Sea keeps being closed, you may start seeing some container companies and firms opening up subsidiaries that start looking at this route. It's a potential for a new change. All right, those were our 5 stories. We looked at fire and collisions on the high seas. Again, danger of shipping is always out there. We're always looking at the next major ship disaster on the horizon. The fact is, a lot of stuff gets loaded on container ships. We don't know if it's properly packed, braced inside the box. Nobody knows until they get to sea. We're seeing the impact of some of this unsanctioned tanker traffic moving in around the area. If the East Coast goes on strike, that opens up a can of worms when it comes to global shipping and the next impact that'll have on freight rates in the presidential election. The Red Sea, are the Houthi on the rise, or is it that the US, the EU, and other nations are pulling back, and are they clearing way for the Israelis to go in? We don't know. We're in a big state of flux right now in the Red Sea, but I got to imagine the Houthi are going to strike back based on this strike launched by the Israelis, a strike of F-15s and F-35s, did a lot of damage in the area. Same thing with Ukraine and the spike in grain and the impact we're seeing from the Black Sea. And then our last story, inflation, the Arctic Express, and this cyber attacks. All of them have impacts we need to be aware of. They impact shipping in every way. And as we've seen before, you throw one big rock in the pond, you create ripples, and it eventually dissipates. But when you keep throwing rocks in that pond, especially after it's rippled, you start getting waves, you start getting into cycles. And that's what we're seeing right now. We're seeing kind of the buildup that we've seen back when COVID hit, which was the huge boulder that went in. We kept seeing small little rocks thrown into the pond that kept up the agitation. And right now we just keep seeing these black swan events, and we can't get that flock of black swans out of here. You just got to get the flock out of here, and we haven't been able to do it. Hope you enjoyed today's episode. It's a long episode, but man, there's a lot to go over in this episode. If you enjoyed today's episode, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so be alerted about new videos as they come out. Leave a comment, share it across social media, and if you can, support the page. How do you do that? Hit that super thanks button down below, or head on over to Patreon and become a monthly, yearly subscriber. It's great to be back. Lots of videos coming your way soon. We're back to where we were. Hopefully we'll get you back up to speed in what's going on with global shipping. Until our next episode, Sal, signing off.